Hi there, it's Transfiguration Sunday and I'm going to share my sermon. The readings are from the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 3, verse 12 to chapter 4, verse 2. And the gospel reading is from Luke 9, verse 28 to up until the first part of verse 43. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start the video up again. So the first reading was from the Apostle Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, which was a port city in Greece, and is very diverse. There's people from all over the Roman world, and the church there reflected that. The church was very, very diverse as well. In this part of the letter that we've heard, Paul is talking about what he has seen and experienced, which a lot of other Jewish people hadn't. He had an amazing experience on the road between Jerusalem and Damascus, which we can read about in the book of Acts. And in that experience, he was blinded by a vision of Jesus. And this led him to stop persecuting the Christians and join them as a follower of Jesus. But now that he's being convicted that Jesus is Lord, he can't relate to his fellow Jewish people who disagree. And he sees them as blinded because they haven't experienced what he has experienced and they don't see what he sees. And that's pretty harmless when he's writing because it's just a disagreement within the Jewish community at that time. But later on, in the centuries that followed, it gets to the point where there's a really clear divide between Jewish and Christian people. And initially, Christians were just a small group without a lot of power, often persecuted. But this attitude towards Jewish people becomes a problem when most of the empire becomes Christian and Christians are in control and they still see Jewish people in this derogative way. It led Christians to cause a lot of harm towards Jewish people. But the good thing that's been revealed to Paul, the thing that's changed him, is that his life's been transformed and he's been led in a different direction. We don't need to be disparaging towards other faiths because of what we've seen, but they haven't. I remember when I left the city and went away to university in another town and had a lot of amazing super spiritual experiences with the Christian group that was on campus. We would often stay up late at night reading the scripture and prophesying and speaking in tongues and singing worship songs and praying for healing. And you could just feel the presence of God's Spirit. It was really intoxicating. And I remember thinking, wow, this is amazing. Why isn't the little traditional evangelical church that I've come from like this? Why have they been hiding this stuff from us? This is the real deal. This is like what it was like in the ancient church. Why are these other churches so spiritually dead? Why can't they see what we can see? And I remember telling people from my old church, and they weren't very impressed, which just proved to me that they were wrong and that they couldn't see what was really going on. They couldn't see what God was doing. Back at uni, one of my friends was going through a crisis because she'd experienced the same spiritual highs and she'd felt the rush of those supernatural experiences, but now she no longer felt it and she felt like God wasn't present with her anymore. And I just didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't know how to be present to her as she experienced God's absence. In today's gospel reading, some of Jesus' disciples are going through a mountaintop spiritual experience with Jesus. And when they're going up the mountain with him, they would have been thinking of this as the place where human beings might meet a God or an angel. They're the places where the heaven is where the earth is reaching up to the heavens. And so ancient people in that part of the world, they'd often built temples at the top of the mountains. They were considered to be holy places. And they would have remembered as Jewish people that their ancestor Moses had gone up a mountain to meet with God and that he'd met God inside a cloud and God had given him the instructions for how they should live a good life. the Ten Commandments, the basis of the Jewish Torah.
Can I interrupt?
Hey, I just had to pause for a moment because somebody wanted to talk to me. So they would have remembered that when Moses was meeting with God, he absorbed so much of God's holiness that his face was shining bright, and this was a danger to other people around. They couldn't cope with the brightness of the holiness that was shining from Moses' face. And so Moses had to cover up his face to protect them from God's holy light that was shining from his face. The idea was that God's holiness was shining so bright that most human beings couldn't see it and live. And so Moses must have been very special because he'd survived it, but the brightness he had absorbed might kill other people around him. And so when Jesus led 3 of his disciples up on a mountain to pray, they might have been expecting something spiritual, possibly something frightening could happen. And when they saw Jesus' clothes shining like lightning, they would have been afraid because it would have reminded them of Moses' face shining with God's holiness. And they might have feared that they would be just destroyed by God's holiness. But in this situation, they're not. In this story, God's holiness is not a danger to human beings. And Peter thinks that since they've had this amazing spiritual experience here, that they should stay there and turn it into a holy site where pilgrims will come and visit Jesus and Moses and Elijah and see the amazing things that they've seen. But Jesus leads them back down the mountain. For Jesus, holiness doesn't mean being separate, being away from society in the wild at the top of a mountain. Jesus leads them back down to the mountain, to their society, with all of its troubles and all of the things that might challenge their faith in God and their faith in humanity. The situation of the suffering child, who no one can help, leads Jesus to despair, even as he's healing the child. Sometimes we might feel like it'd be nice to separate ourselves off from society, just go to a spiritual place in the wild, or go to a place in our mind and just be with God. But the practice of Jesus is a constant rhythm of going back and forth, finding time for quiet and prayer, and then returning to society, to the places where our faith is challenged and where we outwork our faith.